everyone, and welcome to Introduction to Painted Cloths. We're going to talk a little bit about what I know about painted cloths and period, and then a little bit about what I do, which I don't even want to pretend is period, but I've had a lot of people ask me about. So I'm going to share my screen and then talk while I share my screen, which I just pressed the wrong button. That's going to happen a few times. Share. Okay, so here we go. Painted cloths, a discussion, and then the modern materials that I tend to use. Okay, so as Stacey said, if you have questions, please put it in chat. The class is being recorded. If you don't want people to see you, then just switch off your video. I am gonna on this. There will be some links about examples, that period examples, but I also have just a thrown together document of all the bits and pieces I found that I will share on the event page, and then you can find the links if you want to go back to the actual. A lot of them are museum pieces and actually, see it in more detail. And this, obviously, the class will be available on YouTube, but this slideshow will also be available for anybody who wants to use it for whichever way you wish to. And if anybody needs to find me, I'm Benika Crous on Facebook. There's only one of me. There's not going to be much confusion. Okay, so modernly we associate painted canvases with, well, paintings, because these days, if you go to a paint and sip, they will give you a stretch canvas for you to paint on. That is the standard these days. That has not actually always been the case. The first example we have of a stretched canvas painted, and this is not a painted cloth, this is like a painted, like art piece, is actually from 1410. Before 1410, all paintings were generally done either like straight onto the wall or on wooden boards. So it not that there wasn't canvases being painted before that, but it wasn't like art canvases. It's only after that would we start to get, what is it, art, is it just a backdrop, what is it? We are not actually talking about these art painted cloths, and sometimes it's really difficult to make that distinction. Well, is it a piece of like fine art, or is it something that would have been used in the house or in the tent or in the theater, because they were often done by the same very, very good artists. But usually for me, it's the techniques that was used. Now, in period, or post-period, we're like, okay, these are these guys and these are those guys. But we also know from having worked with lots of different things is that people just called stuff what they called stuff. They weren't stuck into, this is the name for this people and this is the name for this people. The same stuff would have been called paintings, and sometimes even tapestries or stains or just cloths, and it's, although it's the same term, it's the same thing. There's all these different terms. So sometimes a painted cloth would have been called a tapestry, and then you look at it and go, no, this is not a tapestry at all. But they didn't do that distinction. We do have that there was some guilds. We had the stainers and the painters, and that's usually the big differential that I do. The stainers worked directly onto the canvas. They didn't, the painters usually put a thick layer in between that and then painted on that so that the canvas wasn't actually stained by the ink that they put on it. And then, of course, in 1502, they joined forces and they were all the same. And then they mixed everything up because they realized that there really wasn't this big distinction about it. But I just kind of wanted to note that there is this distinction, although not always a clear distinction. Now, in the SCA, the most likely that you'll have seen painted cloths is in shields. We have a lot of people that have their shields painted up most amazingly, and it often is canvas that's stretched over whatever the base is, often metal, and then painted up. Now, ironically, in period, there's actually not that many painted shields that's on canvas. There's a lot of them that's on leather and then painted up. But I had to do quite a search before I found one that actually had a layer of canvas. But of course, you know, leather was a lot more readily available at that time than it is these days. So for us, it's, you know, canvas is easy and cheap to find. That's why we use it all the time. For them, more than likely, the leather would have been easier to find. It just was a lot more availability of it in the time. So once again, let's get back to painting and staining. So this is a very old Egyptian example. And if you really look at it, you can see where the canvas is, but the canvas isn't actually the painted bit. There's actually a thick primed layer in between the canvas and the actual painting. Even modern artists actually differentiate between primed and unprimed canvases. This thick layer that kind of separates the pigments from the canvas is what the difference between painted and stained. So if we look at a different Egyptian example, this one is clearly stained. The pigments are applied right onto the canvas and it actually stains the canvas. And that for many people is the definition of it being a painted cloth, the fact that the actual canvas is stained. But this also, versus the previous one we can see, can show you the drawbacks of actually staining that canvas. It's much more difficult to build up those thick layers of paint that that will retain through the ages, the thick layers of pigment. The pigment wears off much more easily, and it also will kind of wash out and fade much more easily. Okay, and then just to add a bit more interest, sometimes we also have what's almost more like a drawing. This is actually a piece of mummy binding that somebody had a lot of fun scribbling little drawings on. And here it's generally not paint, it's more an ink, a stain with ink. So that's why I'm saying it's more a drawing rather than a painting. So when you start researching painted cloths, you will find some articles that will tell you that other than the Egyptian examples, the first examples of painted cloths we get is about the 1350s. And it is right and it's also wrong because we have a few examples from basically late antiquity. This one is from the 4th century, but it's like Egyptians examples, a few from the 4th or 5th century, and then 1350. There's a huge big gap there that we, although it probably was done, we just do not have any good examples of what was done. Now, this particular example is very interesting because the background isn't white. The fabric was actually first dyed blue, and then the figures were put on top of it in lighter colors. And this is very unusual because we all know that it's much easier to go from light to dark to put pigment on top of light than it is to put pigment on top of dark and be able to still see them. You have to put a lot more pigment on the dark to be able to see the light. Now, so this is an example of a banner. One of the main places where we see painted cloths is painted banners, or painted and stained. However, this example, although it is a banner, is actually considered painted rather than stained. And the reason why is this. And just absolutely shocking to me. They have actually removed the image from this part of the banner here and put it onto a different piece of canvas. And that's where the primer comes in, because so much of the pigments are just sitting atop of the primer. You can actually literally take this part of the painting off and put it somewhere else, because you are it's only to a very small degree is it actually staining the cloth behind it. I hope I'm being clear about that, that you guys are seeing what I'm trying to say here. But yeah, it just absolutely blows the mind that this would have happened, that you know, somewhere in the 19th century, they decided, oh, we're going to take this really old banner and just take part of it off. Okay, so painted cloths. Let's look at some of the uses for painted cloths. A lot of the time that we hear about painted cloths, the first use that everybody talks about is as wall hangings. In most of the time period, the houses were not very airtight. And so a lot of the houses would have had a lot of hangings. Now, the bulk of the hangings and also something we don't hear about all the time, the bulk of the hangings were actually just fabrics, so that they wouldn't have been painted up at all. They would have just been fabrics that were hung. And then on the other end of the scale, you get these beautiful and amazing tapestries that was woven, and also not just woven tapestries were hung up. A lot of the hangings would have been beautiful brocade, just pretty fabrics. But then we have this tiny little niche where they decided to do something that looks like tapestries, but was a lot more cheap to do at the time. And we have one institute example that I know of, and this is at Hardick Hall. It's in the chapel, and which is probably the reason why it still exists, because when you put stuff in the chapel, it becomes something else. And these canvases you see at the back here is actually painted canvases that are painted to look like they are tapestries. Here's a zoomed in example of it. And over a distance, it really is indistinguishable from an actual tapestry. They have the same imagery that you would have gotten through the borders. And a lot of them had the exact same imagery that you would have gotten, the pictorial stories that they were trying to tell. Here is another example that's actually just post-period. It's the mid to late 1600s, but it gives us a good example of what these painted cloths would have looked like. And like I said, over a distance, they would have been indistinguishable from tapestries. They really just look just like tapestries. This one starts to show us as well, because the museum is really kind and shows us what pigments were used. And generally, the pigments used to do painted cloths were the cheaper pigments. A lot of them are the yellows and browns that would have been the made from soil, and they could have been produced much cheaper. And then a little bit of the blues and the greens that would have been much more expensive to produce. But I mean, looking at this, it is clear that the bulk of the painting was done with stuff like ochres and blacks. Okay, so when I started researching painted cloths, this was the first one I found. And what's interesting about these panels is that they were actually produced for Henry VIII. So don't let people tell you that painted cloths were just for done as cheap imitations. Painted cloths were done for royalty. So in all levels of society would you have found painted cloths. One of the main reasons why is because they were quick to be produced. So a lot of them were produced for specific occasions, where embroideries or weavings and stuff like that would have just taken too long to get done in time. So we find a lot of painted cloths mentioned for weddings, for funerals, and for events. There's a mention of a lot of painted banners being made for because of travel. And they, last minute, but we want a big display, so we're going to do these painted cloths. This particular painted cloth is really interesting, and it's two things. Number one, a lot of these would have been done for occasions, for a specific occasion, and you could bring them out when you needed to use them, and then roll them up and pack them away when you weren't using them. And that that's also why we get quite a lot of them being used in churches, because there's certain times where you need certain displays in churches, and then there's other times where you want to be able to pack it away. So this particular cloth shows why you sometimes want to pack your cloths away, because at the bottom here, these devices are the coats of arms of Catholic families imprisoned under Elizabeth I. And that's something that you didn't want to have up on your wall all the time. But when you were having your get together with all your Catholic friends, then you wanted to be able to pull it out and display it and show your allegiance. Painted cloths, obviously, very commonly used on banners, and often, as I said, for weddings, for funerals. Here it says that in 1348, Hugh of St. Albans painted for King Edward III's ship flags and 300 different of these, I have no idea how to pronounce it, pennons, with the arms of St. George for his voyage, for a voyage that he was going to take. So it would have been able, you would have been able to, in a very short time period, to produce a vast number of flags for display. These particular two were done for one for a coronation and one for funeral. So, you know, funerals, it's not like you could pre-plan for it. In fact, it was, you could get into a lot of trouble pre-planning for a funeral. So usually stuff had to be produced very, very quickly. The same often for coronations. You want to be right out there with your amazing display to show that you're supposed to be there, but you have a very, very short time period to put that together. Okay, heraldic. A lot of painted cloths do show heraldry. Just in general, we see heraldry everywhere within the time period. So it makes sense that a lot of it would have been heraldic. So this particular cloth actually was done for a church. Once again, one of the main reasons why we still have these examples is because they were done for churches. We are lucky in that there are quite a few church inventories available to us, and painted cloths is mentioned in church inventories on a fairly regular basis. So we know that a lot of churches would have had them, and either just as altar cloths or as to actually hide stuff during Lent, or for special occasions where, you know, it's a certain saint's day and you want to bring out something for that saint's day. And here is one of the most amazing examples of that. So I believe, and I'm not Roman Catholic, so I don't know this stuff, but I believe that there's this thing about hiding the altar during Lent. And for that, quite often, they used painted cloths. So this giant, enormous cloth here is a painted cloth that actually is what permanently set on this pulley system, and then during Lent they let it down and it hides the altar, and then the rest of the year it gets rolled up and it actually just stays up there in the near the top of the church over there. And you can see the just make out the little rolly systems over there. So these were very common. And when I first started researching painted cloth, I did not see any notes about them. And in this last few years in Spain, they've been doing a lot of research about these older painted cloths, many of whom is still in use. This one actually still gets lowered down every year. So it's just absolutely amazing. And on the note of them still finding painted cloths all the time, these were actually found only a few years ago, and they were like literally just stacked in the middle, in the corner of this warehouse where one of the Spanish museums had like just stuff. And they were able to find them, and they're in the process of working on conservation of them. And the article that actually mentions this one mentions that there is more that they've not even taken any photos of, which of course makes me go, please take photos, because I want to see as much as possible. But they're clearly painted cloths, and these ones, they actually have a date of 1520 off, and it's very amazing. Okay, so in the Met, they have this painted cloth that is very interesting because it's not finished. You can see there's like bits and pieces everywhere but unfinished pieces are great because it shows them as how they worked how they actually build up these cloths. And with this one, it is still very clear that, for instance, this brickwork here, like, was literally drawn in with a straight edge, and then they went over it again with ink to highlight the lines. And that is how we, to this day, would quite often reproduce or I quite often reproduce what I do, literally drawing it in with my ruler and then taking my Sharpie and drawing the outlines of it before I start painting it. And it amuses me because I'm like, oh, that's kind of, the modern equivalent of me doing exactly what they would have done in period. Most of the cloths that we have and painted pieces that we have is very big, and they were usually like wall hangings or curtains and stuff like that. That is what makes this little example so amazing, because it's a tiny little bag that was painted up, and it would have been used more than likely in some church to pack some stuff away, and that from there, we have the lamb. What's also interesting here is that they have the ochres, and the blacks and the chalk whites, the cheaper, it's definitely done with the cheaper pigments. What's really interesting here is if you look at this little scrolling around the lamb here, that's actually not blue. It's just different colors gray, but our eyes see it as blue, which I just think is absolutely amazing. Because it looks blue to me. It's amazing how your eyes will deceive you. Now, as I was saying, you can't talk about painted cloths without talking about banners. Here is a classic example of a banner that was painted up. Several parts of this was actually gilded in period. But it wasn't, once again, wasn't finished, because usually these streamer bits at the bottom here would have been cut so that they were streamers at waving in the wind. When we do a lot of heraldry stuff, we tend to look at heraldry books rather than painted heraldry. And I think sometimes we miss out on that, the detail that was done into it, put into it. So if you look at the border of this one, just the level of detailing and the level of shading that was put into this border here, it wasn't just flat colors that was applied. A lot of them were really done in a lot of details. The other thing that we often hear about banners is that they were very thick and unwieldy, especially if you do silk banners. They will be like, oh, these silk banners are nice, but they would have never have been like this in period. Banners in period were much stiffer. And then you have an example like this, where this is actually just soft and flowy silk. And although all of it isn't painted, and it isn't painted the way that we do our silk banners these days, the fact is that because the painted cloths is about staining rather than about putting a stiff layer on top of the fabric and then painting, you can actually have it be very nice and soft and flowy. So still sticking to banners, still sticking to detailing. The detailing in this banner is absolutely amazing. And what is even more amazing about it is the fact that it wasn't painted onto a plain background. Most of the painted cloths we see is painted onto a plain white background. This one is actually painted onto a brocade. So, you know, go out there and decorate everything. Even beautiful brocade fabric that we're thinking, oh my God, this would have been so precious. Yes, it was. It was so precious that they wanted to make it even more. And to do that, they actually put a device on it and painted it on right on top of the brocades. I often get asked about painting clothing. Although there is a lot of examples of painted fabric that was then made into clothing, I have not seen an example where the clothing was made first and then it was painted, and therefore the painting would have gone over where the seams are. I haven't seen any examples of this except for the talismanic shirts that was done in the Middle East. There's quite a few of them, and clearly the shirt was made first and then the shirt was decorated by paint. But just painting a edge on your dress, unfortunately, we don't have any examples of that. Not that I don't do that, because sometimes you just want to do pretty. Towards the very, very end of period, we start to get printed and painted cloths being imported from India. Mostly for the European market, it happened past 1650s. In India, of course, itself, they have been doing it for way, way, way longer than that. But if you're looking at those cloths being imported into the European market, that unfortunately happened post-period. But definitely the pieces that was done was not just printed. These weren't all just screen printed stuff. A lot of them were actually printed and painted. So if you look at this example, some of it is printing, but some of it is has been directly painted on, and of course it was painted on as a stain to stain the fabric. So much so that we have quite a few reports of people going, oh my God, the colors on this fabric, because in India, they were just way ahead of Europe just with their staining technology, with what they were able to do with how the level of color and color stay that they were able to achieve.
Benika, does Kungun asks, does that include fabric stamping with paint?
No, I'm not talking about fabric stamping with paint. That's why with this I wanted to stress that there's actually a difference between stamping and with painting, and definitely there actually is. I've seen examples of fabric stamping that was done after the garment was made, or stamping that was done with the specific garment in mind. But we haven't, unfortunately, have ones where they've done the painting where, so the differential tend to be that with fabric stamping, it's a repeated pattern and they don't lock together. Whereas with painting, you can have a pattern that just continues on and that changes as it continues on. The pattern doesn't necessarily repeat. So we have ones, definitely examples as stamped examples, where the stamping was done later on, but they are distinct stampings, not a continuous painted thing, if that makes sense. Now, the Asian countries are way ahead of us sometimes. This one, there are quite a few examples of amazing painted cloths from Nepal and Tibet. And in fact, at the British Museum, they have 10 or 20 of them. I just wanted to show them just to highlight the fact that they exist. I think the oldest one is about from 1350, and they mostly have religious themes and stuff, but wonderful, wonderful painted cloths if you have an interest and want to explore further from Tibet and Nepal. Now, of course, we know that they painted tents, even though we don't have a painted tent, because we see painted imageries of tents so often, and a lot of them are done in such a way that it's lines and stripes and stuff like that, and you're like, okay, that could have been done with fabric. But a lot of them, like this example, shows that there's a very good chance that they were painted or maybe even stamped or definitely traced, but done with paint after the tent was constructed. So of course I'm like, we all want clothing that was done after it was constructed. And all I can give you is tents. But definitely a lot of example of tents, and there's quite a few example of tents that have heraldry on them. Now, unfortunately, with heraldry, you're never sure if the heraldry is there so that whoever looks at the painting knows who you're supposed to think is in the painting, or if the heraldry is there because there actually was heraldry, because for a lot of stuff, they put heraldry up on paintings just so you would know who it was, not because it's an indication of what was actually there. So, you know, there's always that problem that we have with heraldry. Okay, let's talk about using painted cloths within the SCA. Now, when I make my my absolutely blinged up cow so that I can take him to events, then I totally plan on just painting it up. Now, as I was saying, with heraldry, we don't actually know if it was truly that like this, or if they just did it so you know who it was supposed to be. But who else doesn't want a blinged up cow, man? This is the way to go. Look, he even has gold horns. I want a cow so I can gold leave his horns and take him to events with me. But until I get around to doing my blinged up cow, I have done painted cloths that look like tapestries, and I use them in my tent when I camp, because then my camp just looks so much better. I've used them with heraldry. It has the border, as we quite often see. This particular border is all plants and animals that you find here in Las Vegas. And they, you know, as we would have found them as room dividers and as draft intruders in buildings in period, it just makes sense that we could do the exact same things with our tents when we go camping, and it just makes everybody's campsite look so much better. And for those of you that's wondering, nope, totally modern paint. I have never done a painted cloth with period pigments. One day I will, I promise, but I just haven't gotten around to it. Several years ago, we had an event here in Las Vegas called Talent Crescent War. And for the teacher gifts for everybody that taught classes, we made these welcome mats that we shared with everybody, and they have the TC for Talon Crescent War, and all the designs on them were based on period floor tiles that you find in lots and lots of different places. So here's an example of some of the period floor tiles that we have. Some of them have little designs on. Some of them actually have heraldry on. Um, and these period floor tiles are available through all of STA time periods. So no matter what time period your persona is, you can paint up a beautiful floor cloth, put some period tiles in it, and say that it is there to mimic what the floor would have been like, because some of these are literally from Roman times. If you want to see it taken to the top degree, this is actually the coronation floor in Westminster Abbey. And there is so many different types of patterns in here. It's really worth finding it, zooming in, really looking at all the different patterns. But for me, that's a very good indication of where you can go with these floor tiles. We're not going to be taking a tile floor with us camping, but we can definitely make floor cloths that looks like a tiled floor would have looked in period. On that, I forgot to mention, I have not yet found a period floor cloth, and believe me, I have looked. They seem to have sprung into existence magically around 1700. And we find them from the 1700s, basically up until they invented linoleum. And they were very commonly used in houses during that time period. But as yet, we haven't found anything earlier than that. However, for me, the choice is often between having a blue tarp at the bottom of my tent because, or having a painted floor cloth. And at that point, I'm painting a floor cloth. So this is one of the latest ones I've made, and you can actually see it around over my shoulder there. And what it is literally a canvas painter's drop cloth that you can buy at any hardware store or online. I think this one was like 6 foot by 9 foot, and it cost me like $12. The design is based off Islamic tiles, but if you were to look at the British example, you can see that same types of patterns in the floor tiles there. And I drew it up with my ruler and Sharpie, and then painted it up with cheap acrylic paints. After I painted it up with cheap acrylic paints, I heat set it, and I have done this before, and they last for years and years and years. And isn't this just so much prettier than a blue floor tarp? So I do like to tell people, if you buy, sorry.
Quick question. How can you describe that heat setting process quickly?
Okay. I heat set with iron. I literally put it up. I set up my ironing setup in front of the TV, and I take my iron and I put it down, and I wait a few seconds, and then I move it, and I wait a few seconds, and then I move it, and I wait a few seconds, and it takes forever. But you can definitely feel the difference between it having been ironed and not having been ironed. Now, a friend of mine that does a lot of silk painting, the silk paint needs to be heat set as well. She actually puts it in the oven, her silk painting in the oven. I've never tried that, but in theory it should work. So I'll report back when I actually try it. But for me, The other reason that I iron it is that you can feel the difference. The paint is actually smoother after you've ironed it than before you've ironed it, because cheap acrylics is essentially plastic. So you're fusing that plastic together when you iron it, and when you actually have the weight of the iron on it as well, it just is at that point will takes much longer before it stains, and it cleans off much easier than if you don't do that. So that's why I actually take the time, and it takes time. It takes me like 3 hours to fully heat set one of them, and you can always do it in batches and stuff. But I highly recommend it. So painters drop cloths. Um, if you can, don't buy them online. Go to the actual stores. Some of them are much more loosely woven, and some of them are much tighter weaving. So there's definitely a difference between the ones you get at Lowe's and the ones you get at Walmart. Just the tightness of the weaving, and you want as nice a tight a weave as you possibly can get. So these ones I got online, and these blue ones were a lot of more of a tight weave than the other ones were. And then I bought by the fine tip Sharpies, like by the box, because I, once they start wearing out, I just throw them away. I don't fight with them. I use whatever paint I have available, cheap, acrylics. It doesn't matter. The first ones we did, when we did the welcome mats, we literally had school classroom paints, like giant big jars of them, that we used to paint that up, because one of the people were teachers, and she was like, I didn't know paint go bad, but apparently paint go bad. So she was like, my school has thrown these away. So here we go. I don't know how long she had them, because these basics that I still use all the time, because I have a huge selection of them, some of them are like 10 years old. And I probably lose like 1 out of 10 of them that just harden in the jar. The rest of them are generally still fine. At Walmart, you can get these. They're like 50 cents for the small little container of them. So this really does not need to be an expensive undertaking to just make your tent look amazing. I have fabric medium. I sometimes use fabric medium. I generally don't, just because I'm lazy and I forget. And because you don't have to. If you made something amazing and you're painting it and you want it to still be amazing in 20 years time, yes, use fabric medium. If you're using something, making something that's going to take a lot of wear and tear, you don't need to spend the money. Another thing that's really great is fabric screen printing ink. I had them from a totally different project that I used with, and they are also extremely, they bond with fabric really, really well. It's because that's what they were invented for. And lastly, as I said, I heat set them with the iron. I use a modern iron, but irons were definitely available in period and used in period. They just had to work a lot harder than we do, that just plug it into the wall and it just stays hot. But definitely all the processes of this is periodly, provable. For my last little slide, I would highly recommend that if you are interested in period painted cloths, you read these different articles. They're available online. As I said, this slideshow will be available online as well, and you can go into this and stuff like that. There's some bits of this that is wrong because time has shown them to be wrong. But it's very interesting, especially this first one, actually have a lot of information of what painted cloths, what the materials would have been for doing painted cloths in period. And that's, part of what we're interested in is how it was actually done in period. I forgot to mention this somehow. So when you do a lot of painting, period painting, you probably know that a lot of them were done with egg tempera. Painted cloth generally wasn't done with egg tempera. The reason is that it cracks and flakes off. It has to have a stable base. So for painted cloths, they actually used rabbit skin glue, which you can buy online, giant big thing. The challenge in doing it the period way is to use rabbit skin glue, you have to use it while it's hot. So you can't just pre-mix it and use it like, we're so spoiled doing with paints these days. It's much more of a involved process, but it actually isn't that difficult, other than the fact that you have to keep it hot. It actually isn't that difficult to work with rabbit skin glue. I haven't done it with painted cloths, but I actually have used the rabbit skin glue for other projects, and it's actually fairly easy to work with. And as I said, we're lucky with painted cloths that a lot of the colors is the cheaper pigments. It's actually fairly easy, and a lot of people actually have access in their area, wherever they live, with the ochres and the blacks and stuff like that, which means that you can have the experience and learn how to do this the actual period way without a huge big outlay of funding. Okay, thank you very much. Questions?
Benika, do you want to close down your screen share and we'll bring everybody back up? And then
yes, let me do that. Okay, screen share's gone.